in the game, which under the estimate where it would have actually existed would probably have primarily been relevant between the ages of 12 and 16, all of which would have had the Confederate insurrectionists engage in the function of military subversions in the contest, and thus the exchange of the attempt to destroy the resources, as the resources can be permanently destroyed, according to the system for permanent erasure, which consistently makes them any into that network, and thus the engagement of them seeking the maximizing of their strength would have actively engaged in becoming the whales, which would have been a viable aspect of the system, which would require their hyper investment into purchasing the various products, and the objective being the freezing, which would have, according to the system, created some world spell engaging in the function of major area effect transfers, such as the transfer to Siberia of all of the forces, and thus the use of them attracting the primary concerned groups, and then having the area effect transfer all units that they have sacrificed in order to have gotten David's forces to be in there so that they can acquire a major reduction in status, and thus the effect of having transferred them across the world into a barren location, generating the hyper freeze, was the estimate for their militant action, implementing the position of the hybrid warfare to engage without the obstructions, to do the active contests on the basis of strategic war at the multi fronts, conducting legitimate actions in order to acquire the injuries that is short of crime warfare. And they have already finalized these as answers according to that system, and thus the resources would have to be redirected and corrected in favor of this happening, and thus the action of their hyper investment into that system as the whales uh, would have to have spent major fortune in order to defeat the small fortune that David would have had in that game, which would have primarily just been him conducting active routine functions, which would have generated the resources, and thus the interest fundamentally being to destroy his childhood or erase the resources of it. And the system having actively been incorporated in their spy versus spy engagement would have actively been tracing whether or not their sexual options that they offer would have actually been satisfying their obligations, and thus the action of having broken their interracial relationship pact as Confederates, and thus the action of these various pieces of information culminating into the stories that they're interested in, which would have created their hyperattention and thus their hyperinvestment and thus the manufacture of their strategy, materializing the crafting of insurgents and thus the development of maximizing their potential advantage, which by definition would have failed according to their own estimate, which is why they abandoned it in favor of the war strategy that they chose of direct child predator abuse by the systems of the surveillance actively stalking everyone and thus engaging in terrorist operations and fraudulent excuses in order to use the function of intelligence without investigation, and thus the action of information out of context, creating false narratives for the express purpose of their strawman arguments, which allows them, even them, to be able to come up with clever puns ish in order to establish themselves as being legitimate and hip and into it, and thus the action of having created their own destiny, manufactured their opposition, and thus used the position of their active subversive activities to engage in the multi-function application of skirmish warfare by the hate group for the express purpose of the manipulation by their hate crimes as a status quo activity, defining their core agreements as anarcho-terrorists or anarcho-communists for the white supremacy, which actively has the full division of all of their various factions, which includes the activity of their loyalty to Frazo Bulul to engage in the duplicitous activities of pretending with absolute conviction to be one of the self-contradicting oppositions, and thus the position of having infiltrated the opposition so that they can engage in the function of manufacturing the strawman arguments becomes that activity, and thus the function of creating the hippie movement in order to undermine the anti-war movement becomes the same thing, infinitely diversible, and thus the activity of having engaged in the subversion of their political adversaries in the military function so that they can fully disconnect every aspect of the civilian population's control over the government, as the government of the United States, being their enemy, has been infected, seized, and overthrown as a goal to be reached on a maturity. Thus, systems such as the hyperincorporation of mana into the creation of servants would then express its tracking of the various activities, and thus their interest in the sexual activity would have hyper magnified the potential of the investment under that tech tree, uh, under those particular actions, and thus you could actively use the fate stay night model in order to have promoted various power builds which otherwise would have been irrelevant, and thus the action of them being able to indirectly, by viewing the side effects, um, be able to know how much of X, Y, or Z he would be doing. Um, and that can only be concealed so much, such as player doing their own thing by themselves, as opposed to the active exchanges, the trades being a thing that they would be able to view, the exchanges being something that they would be able to view, the boosts from exchanges being something that they would be able to view, would allow them to physically track each of the things on the basis of its power, making material numbers facilitate the activity of them determining how potent X, Y, or Z would be in its various applications, such as the hyperinvestment into the mana for the servants for their fundamental alignments, which would then magnify each various potential. But that being said, their attempt to do that actively would increase the viability of those services, and that game would hyper succeed on the basis of its amplification of their activity, and thus their hyper investment into it from their various inputs of purchasing products and actively maintaining aspects of it, and thus promote active businesses in that system, would have magnified exponentially David's network, as the viability of each of the promotions from the grind set function, such as the function of, like in WoW, when people go farming for gold. It's that kind of thing. except for the promotion in the real world businesses, would have actively benefited from the activity as it would have been incorporated into the function of various benefits. And thus, the act of them declaring the war in function would have been itself a hyper investment into activity, which increases foot traffic, which increases the exchanges of resources, which hyper absorbs more of the militants' actions and funds into the network cycling, and thus the network maintaining the contract's resources absorbs outsiders' resources and then mostly trades on the bonus credit score, allowing the network itself to keep as much of the earned revenue as possible as a collective unit, and thus the action of their war under the hybrid warfare mechanism would have exponentially made this more potent and thus increased wealth catastrophically. It's like in the Elvis movie, the I hate Elvis button, except, it's slightly different, but it's the same exact concept. Their hatred is the thing funding him. The more they hate him, the more they pay him. I'm not sure specifically, but it's viably estimated that they would have focused primarily on darkness and fire type mana sets, which would have hyper accelerated the function of the anti fire action, which makes cold an act of weakness, um, and thus the action of them setting that up facilitates the position for the world spell, which would have sent David's game units in the large area for the trap that they would have set, which is outside of a lot of the bug types, would have actively had the other hyper powerful units attracting their attention, repelling the fire types, and thus engaging in the function of their highly expensive teleportation into Siberia function, which would then be subverted by the hyperinvestment into the evolution of adaptation from the additional mana being spent exclusively on the function of defending against that action, as many of their units being sacrificed would be understood to have died in the transfer outside of David's units, which would have hyper saved the mana in order to have accelerated the adaptation, becoming ice types in the change. And thus the estimate being that David's position in Hawaii would have facilitated a certain series of advantages would be transferred to the Siberian function, and thus their world spell would be against the Hawaiian Islands digitally. And the active extension of these systems, which having been founded on David's early life under the plot which they would have developed and started executing in their Poison Script version for defamation to cut the roots out of David and Don Bull Sr., and thus the action of that being applied under the position where they would have been forced to be legitimate by the American system is the viable position, assuming the peace agreement under the contracts from the Confederates to engage in non opposition to their policies would have succeeded by that action, which would have included the function of Congress actively telling David to play nice with them, and thus the demonstration of the viable non aggression between David and the white supremacists being normalized in their fractions, and thus the action of this being applied would have, from their narrative, been a fraudulent position from California's active racist position of uh, actively conducting actions of those who are socially undesirable to stop being able to reproduce or have children from their uh, genetic genocide faculties, which evolved into their trans movement, which generates the position of them being able to advance their eugenics exponentially, is actively conducted by their defamation mechanisms for framing people, which would then generate the position of the distraction of false accusations against Don Bowles, and thus the position of it being translated under the position, such as with Trump saying that they should go after the families of the people, which is then amplified by the position of the CIA's backdoor structure, facilitating everyone that is connected to targets to become viable targets, and thus the action of active dismantlement of entire networks of peoples, and thus the racist exponential function of racism without race is then engaged as a mechanism by their strategic warfare strategy, and thus the action of the book Racism Without Race is conducted exponentially by their racist dog whistles as they engage in their fraudulent cover stories to engage in their long term intergenerational conflicts, scrimmaging and conducting the slave raids for the exponential advantage of the spoils of war by their lawfare engagement as they engage in the permanent mechanisms of criminal activity in order to engage in extortion rackets and racketeering operations for the uh, absolute dominance and expansions of the Christian nationalist position of manifest destiny for the fake morality to be spread, which is materialized into the position of the protocols of learned elders of Zion, which is then actively incorporated into the advancement of that war strategy to engage in the function of compromising the factions that they had built in dividing themselves so that on maturity they can eradicate the radicals, as when the ridiculous has become normal, the radicals are then exclusively dangerous and must be disposed of. Just as a recap, the Christian nationalists are an extension of the deep state from the Confederates, satanic radicals, which, having engaged in the Druid function, has actively sought the infiltration of the church in order to conduct conversions, and thus the act of converting the people who go to church into the satanic religion facilitates the incremental changes, such as but not limited to the function of changing the rituals into the satanic rituals as they normalize the practice into the alteration, such as the spirit infusion into the function, and thus the action of conducting the unholy communion, replacing the communion systematically, and thus the action of rituals like the cremation of care, and thus the recommendation of these systems cultivate the disconnection systemically from the undermining of the connection of the God of the Bible with the church, and thus the action of having polluted it exponentially into the taint of the satanic, corrupting it into exclusive functions of evil as it hyper-compounds into its terrorist operations and thus engages in the frazo-bulu functions of fake morality as they hyper-extenuate themselves into the ritual transformations, becoming the extraordinary corrupt variants of those who take the left hand path, and thus the action of the conversion of Christianity into Satanism, and thus the conversion of Lucifer into the devil becomes the function of converting the church into the Church of Satan. as they systemically misquote the Bible until they fully purge every connection of loyalty to it and ignore it completely, such as, but is not limited to, the refusal to defend religious rights against those who have been targeted by their fake structures in their systems of conquest in order to assert criminal advantages as they unwittingly or wittingly incorporate the function of normal terrorism and hate crimes as an active aspect of society, similar to when the KKK, having actively conducted the espionage militia format of the recreation of the Confederacy, which had actively incorporated the Southern churches into it, and thus the action of the Black Sabbath having been normalized into these activities with a veneer of godliness while condemning godliness. And to that extent, the subversion of nature in order to advance themselves, as the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, or the fruits of the poison tree, engages in its inversion in order to engage in the systematic advantage of the control of nature, similar to, but is not limited by, the game's position from their war strategy to bring, similar to the function of the Siberia winter in the Marvels with Doctor Strange. In his absence, the new leader of the Wizards actively forgot to conduct the rituals in order to stop the transfer of the blizzards, which filled the mansion with ice and snow. And that is basically the concept of the spell that would be happening in the Hawaiian location, transforming it from extreme heat into extreme cold, and thus the mechanism of the permanent lures for ice in the Hawaiian areas for the extended period of time uh, after that exchange, which I believe they estimated was going to have been enacted around the time David was 16, quote unquote, freezing the majority of his assets. And thus the mechanism would engage in the mirrored reflection of the strategic advantages, which would then materialize. I believe it's Garuta uh, in Pokemon would be the basic background story, which they would have engaged in the system of systematically trapping and concentrating the majority of the extra value in another primary conflict area outside of Hawaii. I'm not specifically sure. I believe it would probably be on the East Coast. But the system of defeating it would have been transforming their hyper mana position into the inversions according to its background story. Now, this being based fundamentally on the original position that David would have been the hyper advantaged party as to be more powerful than the rest of the Confederate powers inside of the United States government, and thus the action of David being loyal to the United States and thus loyal to national security of the United States would engage in the function of the power being returned to law from him being stronger than the Confederates. His capacity to have destroyed the Confederates upon the whim of their crime facilitates the absolute position and thus the action of their reversal of time in order to correct against it and create the mirrored reflection and thus the action of its collapse and conducting the revenge and retaliation against every advantage humiliation that he would have defeated them with by their various strategies which would have failed and blown up in their faces, which then materializes into the position of their turning their illusion into reality, failing because of the law enforcement that exists at that point, requires the purging of anyone loyal to the United States inside of those functions, facilitating the protection of their recrafting of things in their satanic image for the white supremacist nation, which is reflective of the realm that they would have thrown Giratina into, which is the perfect explanation of their core nature, as he would be absorbed entirely, and thus the mana conversion, hyper-concentrating the absorption, spends that function in the existence of their concentrated identity, which has turned itself into an entire area, similar to, I think it's Abaddon, is affiliated with the existence of the abyss itself in the religion for the function of hell, and thus the action of their core identity is who they are, and thus the restraining of the party in who they are to suffer the natural effects of their existence, thus puts them in a permanent stasis, restraining and being restrained by the grappled position, not being capable of engaging in any legal exchange without revealing their core nature as anti-law children of perdition. To this extent, the function would have, in their subversion, created the hyper-exaggeration of the mana pool, which would then generate the origin forme Gerita, which would also facilitate the alliances, such as the division of the attack value, which would be absorbed, which would create the Lunanla, but similar to the function in D&D of necrotic energy being its own hyper-extenuation, facilitates the implosion variation, similar to in a nuclear bomb, would create the function of the shattered reality, thus generating the exponential shadow characters who, absorbing the shadow implosion power of the mana, would then facilitate their hyperpowers, which then would materialize into the megas, such as the Mega Bennett and the Mega Gengar, which would then facilitate the function of the transformation of those eradication locations, and thus the exchange of their extreme force facilitates the complete transformation, although the function of these exchanges would not have been lost to the exchange from their attack, as the engagement of the specific counters in the topsy-turvy reverse realm that they would be attacked into would maintain their original obligations and loyalties, and thus the mechanism of the conversion being a compulsory evolution as opposed to any functional material change to their identities. And thus the hypervaluation is not just the function of the bonds demonstrating the full potential of the variant, but also the reabsorption and dissemination of the attack itself, which being the function of having conducted the counter to the attack, turns the attack power itself into its own source of mana, which then generates the superiority of those defense forces, who, having received those promotions, would then materialize their advantages under the original hierarchy, and that inversion realm engaging in the reflection, such as the function of it being the reflection against a shield, would facilitate the mass interdimensional travel of these shadow powers, which then would materialize them all around the world at what would seem an arbitrary locations and times, and thus the position of the mechanism would refine the mega certified parties, which would then mechanize the capability of the concentrated powers, having done their primary damage, and then in the exchange having been repurposed into the reformed world. But basically, the attack would have shattered the function of time and space and broken into the multi-dimensional facet of the multi-world universe theory, and thus the parallel universes having been the function of its creation, creating the scattering of the participants, thus the mechanism of the division of the forces, which would be reunited upon a mechanism in a time and location of its own arbitrary choosing, and thus the restoration of the function generates the reuniting of the parallel potentials, materializing them into the consolidation of reality, and to this extent the function of its restoration on the basis of having delayed it but not defeated it, and to the extent they seek the function of turning the mechanism into the devil, and thus the mechanism of having justified the function of their narrative for the legitimacy of their devil religion, and thus the justification and tolerance of their participants' objectives and material identities. And to this extent, they have recreated the function of their story and pasted it onto their targets to reflect that nature in the distraction illusionary function, creating an inverted world as the world, and thus the mechanism of the two having been exchanged are merely reflections of themselves, like a tentacle horror film, and thus the mechanism of these exchanges as reflections onto themselves conduct the inverted control systems, which are hyper compounded in difficulty by the reflection of the shattered mirror of reality, reflecting onto itself as it seeks the objective of reattaining materialization from the distortions which had shattered it, trapped and ensnared into the other dimensions, which, being completely correct, are in fact taken for granted as not being reality, as the function of the illusion becoming reality becomes the action of reality becoming the illusion, and thus the impersonator has to destroy the thing that they are impersonating in the mirrored reflection reverse opposite of itself, and thus the mechanism of its distortion and its various narratives creates the functional exchange of control over the narrative, and thus the set time for the delay, which would have removed David from the game functionally, as the automated activities of that function would have been digested, and thus the mechanism of his inability to have participated in any meaningful way outside of those extorted exchanges turned the game into the function of him acquiring the solving of those riddles and puzzles and other interests, which are then reflected on the basis of the recovery, as the system would not functionally defeat him, and thus the mechanism of it being exchanged creates a parallel universe where they are participating in, and the other parallel universes where David is participating in as the totality of the conceptual reality uh, is reabsorbed into a singular focus. Now, the extent of the mirrored reflection opposite, chaos has become order, and order has appeared like chaos, and thus the systems have facilitated themselves as the retaliation for the protection of their illusion pretending to be reality, that would be dissolved upon any legal light, and thus the obstruction of the functional evidence, and thus the criminalizing of evidence, and thus the criminalizing of rationality, and thus the criminalizing of law and order, and thus the action facilitates its hyper-compound value in the capability of law in its restoration, has become the enemy of those engaged in the Confederates on patrol mechanism, materializing the illusion and the dismantlement and eradication of the law, and thus the mechanism of the transformation into the distorted beast facilitates the engagements of the new beast structure, and thus the eldritch horror in its full correct translation can be fully felt upon maturity, but not until then, and thus the mechanism of the system requiring their entrapment as its victims make itself, by the scams, systemically vulnerable to it on purpose, and thus retaliate against the law, and thus encroach upon themselves in their own vulnerability, that they might on maturity be devoured as a delicious morsel, and them as a snack, having been radicalized against law and order, may be dissolved and consumed in the static tumult of it, and the chaos will only breed the right type of white.